You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. With the help of a wide range of guests, we examine how war and peace are experienced in different periods and places, and we discuss the world-building impact which representations of conflict and its aftermath can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice König, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. I have two guests with me today who are both involved in our newly founded Ancient Peace Studies Network, Professor Polly Lowe from Durham University and Dr Hannah Cornwell from the University of Birmingham. Polly is a historian of ancient Greece with a particular interest in political history and interstate relations. Her 2007 book on interstate relations in classical Greece examined the norms and ethics that shaped relations between Greek city-states, the scope and enforcement of international law, and the complexities of diplomacy across the classical period. She's an expert on Greek inscriptions and has published on many other aspects of Greek political history, including imperialism, political mechanisms for ensuring or restoring stability, discourses of victory and defeat, and the commemoration of the war dead in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Hannah's research focuses on Roman socio-political history, and she's particularly interested in Roman imperialism, discourses of power, ideas of peace, and approaches to diplomacy. Her 2017 book, Pax and the Politics of Peace, examined the two generations that span the collapse of the Roman Republic and the Augustan period in order to understand how the concept of Pax Romana, Roman peace, evolved as a central ideology of Roman imperialism. She's also published multiple articles and chapters on the representation of Roman peacemakers in literary accounts, on negotiation and diplomacy during the Roman civil wars, physical sites of diplomatic practice, and the performance and theatre of diplomacy, among other topics. And these are all areas of huge interest to the Visualising War and Peace project, so I'm really looking forward to our conversation. But first, Polly and Hannah, let me welcome you to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I second that.
So I want to start, if I may, with a very broad question, and I'll pose it to both of you, but I guess I will start with Polly, whose period of expertise is the earliest. So Polly, many of our encounters with Greek antiquity through lessons at school or films or online gaming and so on give us the impression that war fighting was a recurring preoccupation. And of course, we hear a lot less about times of peace in the ancient Greek world. How accurate or misleading is that? Did war dominate interstate politics during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, or should we be paying more attention to the work that went into maintaining stability or preventing the outbreak or recurrence of war, or even resolving conflict?
I want to answer yes to both questions, actually. I think war is endemic in the Greek world, and we can't sort of airbrush that out of our picture of what this period was like. And also, I think we have to try and recognise that it's not just the major conflicts, it's not the Persian War, the Peloponnesian War, the things that make it into the big historical narratives, but probably there's also just a lot of low-level conflict going on. There's a war we hear about, a border dispute between two communities, Priene and the island of Samos, that seems to kick off, or we know that it's starting in the Archaic period, so the 7th century BCE. It's still going on in the 3rd, 2nd century BCE, and probably just sort of rumbles on, and this sort of low-level fighting isn't much talked about, was probably very much part of life. On the other hand, I also agree with you that we should pay attention to the work that went into trying to avoid war. It's not that Greeks welcome war. They didn't always glamorize war. They were aware of the costs of war and made serious efforts to try and avoid it. They weren't particularly successful, but we should still pay attention to the efforts that they made.
Thank you. Yes, and that answer resonates a bit with a previous podcast discussion we had with Lauren Benton on a much later period of time, whose research focuses on so-called small war, this sort of lower level ongoing rumbling conflict that doesn't make the headlines, but that costs so many lives. We'll dig more into the ways in which maybe the Greeks tried to prevent or resolve conflict in a bit. But Hannah, I'd like to pose the same question broadly to you. So when we think of the Roman Empire, we do inevitably think about armies and battles of conquest and the brutal subjugation of non-Romans at the point of a spear or a sword. And of course, the final century of the Roman Republic not only saw a lot of imperial expansion, but also lots of civil war as well. And as a result, there's a huge amount of published scholarship on Roman war fighting. And with the exception of your book and a handful of others, there's very little on Roman ideas of peace and peace building. Is that just a natural consequence of historical reality? Or is there actually a lot of Roman peace history that we're simply not paying enough attention to?
Well, I feel it's going to be quite a similar story in many respects, the one that Polly just introduced us to, because we cannot avoid the fact that the Roman world, Rome as a political state, was a militaristic one, was a violent one, and there's a reason why those images that we have of when we first think about Rome, whether it's gladiators in the arena and that kind of violence, or Roman legions marching through provinces, there's a reason that those sort of images endure. Rome's territorial conquests were, of course, aspirational for later imperial powers, and a really good example of that is the maps that Mussolini put up in Rome. He had 4 maps showing Rome's growth from just a single city-state into this huge territorial empire by the early 2nd century CE, and then added his 5th map of his own expansion and conquest into North Africa. And of course, the Romans themselves provide us plenty of evidence to think about them in that way. Historical accounts and triumphal monuments celebrate the subjugation of non-Roman people that you mentioned, with the Greek world, or the classical and Hellenistic world, visualizing the growth of Rome from a city-state to a territorial empire. And I suppose in many respects that's what makes it different perhaps from the Greek world in certain respects. But to think about it solely in terms of war, I think, is to make the matter far too simplistic, to simplify the story. And the Romans themselves thought about peace quite a lot. I mean, they do practice. And the very foundations of the city, the histories they tell themselves, at least in the later period, about their foundations, that Rome has always been a community that has been founded on both conflict and mediation. So we think about the stories such as the Sabine women. And it's interesting, it is the women mediating between 2 communities to create Rome. And while Rome's first king and founder was associated with war, the second king, Numa, is considered a king of peace. Again, at least in the stories the Romans tell themselves, that he brings justice and religious observation, that he builds the temple of Janus Quirinus, who becomes an indicator of when Rome is at war through the opening of the doors and when Rome is at peace through the closing of the doors. So there's this unavoidable, and in many respects very obvious, link between war and peace as these sort of 2 juxtaposed positions. But in a sense, with Rome's expansion as first a hegemony and then an imperial power, it's not just about war and conquest. To go back to what Polly said, we're thinking about diplomacy and peacemaking as being equally important. For the Romans, peace also is a justification for empire, or it becomes that by at least the late Republican period, so the 1st century BCE. Even before we get an empire with a capital E with an emperor, Rome's Republican Empire by the mid-1st century BCE is starting to be justified through peace and the stability and privileges that Rome can confer on subject communities because of that.
Yeah, so the weaponization of peace almost as a tool of imperialism, colonization, oppression. You've given us some fascinating food for thought there. As you were talking about Numa, I was remembering that at the start of Livy's History of Rome, Aeneas, the original founder of Rome, is also introduced as a man who was more of a peacemaker than his other Trojan counterparts. So, as you say, that the idea of being good at peacemaking is woven into Roman cultural identity myths. But you're right also that this association with imperial violence and conquest not only mattered in the Roman world, but as you've pointed out with Mussolini's 5th map, as something that later powers then used to legitimize their own actions, their own identity in mythology. Polly, we've heard a little bit already about the ways in which some of our Roman sources, Roman thinkers, conceptualize peace as friendship, but also as justification for expanding Rome's empire. What can we reconstruct from surviving sources about ancient Greek concepts of peace, or even the desirability or not of peace in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE?
So I think one important thing to say is that we're very reliant on Athenian sources. So we don't have a good sense of what the Greeks as a whole thought about how they conceptualized peace. And it could be that the Athenians are doing something a bit different from the rest of the Greek world. One thing the Athenians do at a relatively late date, it's usually dated around 375 BCE, is start to worship peace as a goddess. So sort of personified, abstract concept of peace becomes the focus of state cult. And the prompt the creation of that cult, and I think this resonates with what Hannah was just saying, seems to be a military victory. So the Athenians win in a campaign, and the way that they celebrate this is by starting to worship the goddess Peace. So peace is a consequence of military power. We have a statue which is normally dated to around the same date and often sort of linked to this cult. And it depicts Peace as a female goddess holding the infant wealth. So that's one thing that we can see, and we find this in other Athenian sources as well, a very, very strong conceptual link between peace and prosperity. So you achieve peace through war, but then once you've got peace, then it generates wealth and prosperity for your community. So that seems to be how the Athenians are thinking about it, particularly in the 4th centuries BCE. What's really hard to tell is how widespread that was in the Greek world. I think we only have good evidence for peace being worshipped, so a cult of peace, in one other place, and that's a small city called Miletopolis in Mysia, out to the east. It's quite possible, though, that they imported this cult from Athens, so it wasn't something that they'd come up with independently. This is direct Athenian influence on this community. Otherwise, so the Spartans, as far as we know, don't worship peace, for example. It seems to be an Athenian peculiarity.
That will please all the people who are interested in Spartan hard men, won't it? But Polly, I want to ask you a little bit also about the so-called common pieces of the 4th century BCE, as I know that some scholarship argues that what we see there is a shift in understanding of peace building, peacemaking, peacekeeping, but that's not a view that's held by all. So could you just tell us a little bit more about these so-called common pieces that we get in the 4th century?
Yes, so a little bit of just background to these multilateral peace agreements. The first successful one is made in 386 BCE, and then there's about half a dozen or so that are made involving a number of Greek states. So they're described as common. Exactly how many of the Greek city-states are actually involved is slightly uncertain. They're referred to primarily in later sources as common pieces, so as a peace treaty, rather than the more normal Greek word for a treaty is soumachia, so a fighting with. So there seems to be a shift in terminology, that this is an agreement that's not primarily focused on going to war, it's about maintaining peace. That might be a significant shift. I think the reason why some people are more pessimistic partly is that these things don't work, they don't last for very long. So it seems to be the case that this agreement is made, and then pretty quickly the Greeks start fighting each other again. And the other reason why some people are a bit less convinced that there's a real shift in mindset is because this terminology, the common peace, is primarily found in later sources, writing in Greek, but in the Roman period, who might in fact be influenced by more Roman ways of thinking about a peace that aren't quite endemic yet in the 4th century Greek world. I'm more on the pessimistic side, but I think there is something changing in this period. The fact that these multilateral agreements are becoming more common might reflect a sort of equalization of power to some extent in the 4th century Greek world. We're not so much in a world where Athens, Sparta call the shots and do what they want to do, and smaller states who might have more of an interest in trying to establish a bit more stability and reduce the amount of endemic conflict. It could be in their interest to try and promote these agreements just to sort of keep the larger powers under control.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to get these glimpses, on the one hand, of sort of an idealization of peace in the person of the goddess Irene, that's the result of a sort of major victory and therefore idealized by the victorious power, but then a more pragmatic approach, a more pragmatic conceptualization that reflects more of a multilateral, multinational equalizing of power, as you say. You've mentioned, fascinatingly, the possibility that some of these sort of later conceptions of peace in the Greek world are influenced by Roman thinking and Roman expansion. And that brings me back to you, Hannah. Your research on the Pax Romana has traced the complex evolution of Roman conceptions of peace and peace building over a really tumultuous period in Roman history. So can you tell us a little bit about how ideas and discourses of peace changed as the Roman Republic faced increasing internal strife during the 1st century BCE and a civil war loomed large, against the background, obviously, of a sort of expanding empire too?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think linking into what Holly mentioned about the potential influences of Roman peace on Greek ideas, and as you mentioned, my work on thinking about how Roman concepts of peace evolve relative to socio-political changes, I think it's also worth thinking about what does peace mean to the Romans pre-Civil War in the context of international relations, but also internally in a sense, because they have this concept of Pax Deorum, which is peace with the gods. And it's effectively a contractual arrangement that they have with the gods to try and maintain the gods' favour. And we see it in the works of Livy, particularly in the early histories, the early books, in circumstances when pestilence plagues a city or when Rome suffers a military disaster. And how do they explain this? They explain it by the fact that a military tribune in 390, for example, did not maintain peace with the gods. And that explains Rome's defeat. But within that, there is this idea of peace being something that is contractual, agreed between two parties. But within that, there is an inequality to the partnership. When we come to, as it were, the real world in inverted commas and Rome negotiating with other communities, it's extremely rare for Rome to seek peace from other communities. They will bestow peace on communities who seek it from Rome. So Rome positioning itself, at least ideally and rhetorically, in a position of superiority. And that then has an effect on what happens in civil war. As I mentioned earlier, Rome has always been a community that's kind of had an internal power struggle going on. And this is reflected in the histories written in the 2nd and the 1st centuries BCE, constant sort of conflict. But by the time we reach the second half of the 2nd century BCE, we're starting to see the politicization of violence and the use of language that really belongs to external relations being applied to relations between political equals. So in 88 BCE, for example, we have the introduction of what scholarship tends to refer to as hostis declarations. Really, it is a member of the civic community being judged, normally by the Senate. How the Senate have the power to make this judgment has a bit of a question mark over it. But to judge this person who is legally or was legally a citizen of the community to be a hostis, a public enemy. And that then allows actions against them as if they were, or indeed they have been judged to be an enemy. So we start to see external war and the language associated be applied to internal conflicts. And as we get to civil war proper, and 88 actually is the first proper civil war, the Romans themselves refer to it as bellum civile. That's where we start to see the difficulties of, okay, we can make our internal opponents enemies of the state and justify violence against them and legitimize our own actions. But how do we then deal with the need to negotiate and make peace and resolve conflict? Because you've now got a situation where you've got Romans making peace with Romans. And if we go back to that former idea of pax being this contractual relationship, which actually has built into it inequality, that starts to potentially become problematic. It becomes an important concept through which they think about these internal relations that doesn't appear to have existed previously. And it goes hand in hand with, or the language of external war being used internally. And we see, particularly in the civil wars of the 40s, so first between Caesar and Pompey, and then in the second half of the decade between the assassins of Caesar and Marcus Antonius and young Caesar Octavianus, a kind of power struggle involving the language of peace. In the outbreak of the war between Caesar and Pompey, we see, for example, one of their political contemporaries, Cicero, who has left us a vast amount of evidence in speeches and letters, but he is really fixated at the end of 50 and the beginning of 49 with reconciliation between Caesar and Pompey as the only way to save the state. And he keeps going on about himself as a facilitator, as an auctor of peace between the two, because he is friends with both of them. He's an amicus to both, and he sees his way as facilitating. So these interpersonal relationships allowing him to facilitate that. And Caesar himself will take the idea of peace and his apparent desire to reconcile with his civil war opponents as a way to legitimize his position, but also delegitimize his opponents. Because in his De Bello Civili, his civil war narrative, he is always the one who is trying to seek negotiation, seek in-person conversations and conferences. And his opponents are the ones who are delaying, stalling, not coming to the negotiating table. So they're kind of rejecting peace through that. So he's able to frame himself as someone who is working for the good of the state because he's seeking these ideas of peace and reconciliation. And he also implements that rhetoric in letters he writes as well, even though Cicero himself doesn't really quite believe how genuine Caesar is about this desire for reconciliation. When we get to 44 and Caesar is now dictator perpetuo, without end virtually, that's the first time that we see pax, so Roman peace personified on a coin. And so it's interesting what Polly said with the Athenian goddess of peace, only really emerging, in early 4th century BCE in the context of war and conflict. Because despite the fact that the Romans have this Pax Deorum, this peace of the gods, Pax was not worshipped as a deity until most likely the altar of Augustan peace. But we see under Caesar at least a representation of peace as a female head on a coin, very clearly labelled Pax, because no one's seen her before, and we need to make it really clear what she is. And on the other side of the coin, we've got two hands joined together. So the dextrarum junct, which was for the Romans and other Mediterranean communities and civilizations, signs of agreement, of loyalty, of trust. And so Caesar combining these two things on a coin is a way to sort of say his version of Pax, what it's bringing, what he's achieved. Again, this idea of negotiation and communication. And yet the following year in 43, Cicero, who at the beginning of the decade was so keen on promoting peace, completely flips the script when it comes to peace with Marcus Antonius. So this is Cicero's famous Philippic speeches, which he gives against Antony. And from the beginning of 43, there is a large faction in the Senate who want to negotiate with Antony. They want to make peace with him. Antony is besieging another Roman commander, Decimus Brutus, one of the assassins, at Mutina. And the Senate well, let's negotiate. Let's see what he wants. Let's make peace. And Cicero says, no, Antony is a hostis, is an enemy in all but name. We cannot make peace with this man. That would equate to slavery. So there's this malleability of peace, depending on how you frame who you're making peace with when it comes to civil war. At least for Cicero, he's using it to fit the circumstances in terms of who he wants to see included in a civic community. This period of trying to sort of test out how to make peace and the language of peace fit with this internal conflict, this language of war, how to legitimize one's position in relation to the state.
Really fascinating. And what you've given us a bit of an insight into there, Hannah, is the way in which really a relatively small handful of very powerful people / men wrestled with and kept remoulding concepts of peace for their own ends. And I'm sure we can think of one or two examples in the modern world right now where celebrating one's role as a peacemaker is a pathway to a self-aggrandizement and, maybe a triumphal ovation of some sort or another. But yes, I've actually been teaching Cicero's letters and Caesar's civil war to my students this semester, and we've been really interested in exploring the way in which there's this uncertainty around the language of peace initially in the antebellum period, in the period before the conflict really erupts between Caesar and Pompey, and peace's efforts around appeasement are described in the language of friendship and otium, leisure, and then peace, pax, comes in as a much more politicized, as you say, sort of external almost concept. So Polly, just to come back to you, Hannah's talked us through some of the ways in which the socio-political context in Rome of civil war really changed discourses and conceptualizations of peace. I want to come back to the Greek world a little bit and just think a little bit more about imperialism and changing interstate relations in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE and how they might have impacted on changing concepts of peace in Greek interstate politics.
So I think what's striking in the Greek world, certainly in the classical period, is how little connection is made between empire and peace. This model of an empire as something that brings peace is something we really don't find. And I think that's because of the sort of quirk of how empire works in the classical period, that it has its origins usually in military alliance, and it finds its justification in a promise to go and fight a war against some sort of external enemy, primarily in this period, Persia. So that's what the Athenians promised to do in the 5th century. They don't really promise to do, but they sort of pretend to do a little bit in the 4th century. It's what the Spartans sort of do a bit in the 4th century. So empire is based on a promise of war against someone else, some safely differentiated other with a capital O, which will generate benefits, but not so much on a promise of peace. To some extent, there's a promise of protection from internal enemies, so other Greek states. So we see that most clearly in the alliance that the Athenians put together in the 4th century, the so-called Second Athenian League, which says we're going to protect members of this alliance from infringements on their autonomy. so their internal political freedom from unspecified enemies, but in this case it's the Spartans and also the Persians that the Athenians fairly clearly have in mind. But they don't use peace. They don't promise peace. They promise political autonomy, freedom from certain financial and other encroachments. But peace is really not talked about. It's quite a striking absence, which I hadn't really thought about much until you asked this question, because I guess it's a real difference from how the Romans, at least at some points, think about what they're offering with their empire.
I think you have written about one quite unusual inscription, haven't you, in which peace is talked about in more favourable terms than normal. And there's an unusual declaration of not really feeling like going to war on this occasion. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, it is an inscription very puzzling in many ways and no longer extant. So we're reliant on a copy made by a mad French monk, but that's a story for another podcast series. It's in Attic dialect, so seems to be an Athenian creation, but wasn't found allegedly in Athens. So it seems to be possibly some rare non-Athenian evidence for attitudes to peace. The Greeks have been invited to get involved in a rebellion of Persian regional governors who are rebelling against the Persian king, and they've presumably sent a messenger to the Greeks saying, do you fancy being part of this war? And the Greeks write back and say, actually, no, because we've made a common peace and we're quite happy at the moment and we don't want to get involved in your war. But I think, again, what's important and interesting about that we're precisely not in an imperial context. This is presented as a collective decision made by the Greeks as a whole. We have no sense that there's a leading Greek power. This doesn't come from the Athenians, doesn't come from the Spartans. So one might even say, I don't think we could definitively say this because the evidence isn't quite strong enough, that it's precisely the absence of empire which allows the Greeks to talk about peace in this context. But it's also a one-off, this bit of evidence. It's the one time that we find them saying we'd really like peace rather than war.
Yeah, really interesting. And to draw out these contrasts between cultures that we think of as equally warlike somehow, and yet warlike and interested in peace and conceptualizing peace, conceptualizing stability and protection and all of the other things that go along potentially with peace or indeed warfighting in very different ways. Hannah, you've already talked us through a little bit about the ways in which notions of imperialism or experiences of imperialism fed very strongly into evolving understandings of peace in the Roman world. We actually have a phrase in the modern world, the Carthaginian peace, which is a perpetrator's peace, a top-down peace, a very violent kind of oppressive peace. Can you tell us a little bit more about the violence of peace building that was part of Roman imperial policy effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this highlights one of the issues with the term peace, right? We've already got to grips with the fact that the Greeks conceptualize peace differently from the Romans, and we translate the Greek irene and the Latin pax as peace, but they're not necessarily meaning the same things. And from a modern Western point of view, we often think of peace as sort of tranquility, an absence of war, but it has this sense of non-violence perhaps. And for the Romans, that is definitely not the case. It's something that is often implemented as a consequence of violence, but it is also something that can perpetuate violence. And the Romans themselves, at least in the imperial period, are aware of that and of the problems of that. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But I wanted to return to what I said previously about pax being sort of this contractual agreement between two people, that it is relational. Because what happens at the end of the civil wars with the rise of the Principate and one-man rule, and Tacitus in his histories, at the beginning of book 1 of his histories, no doubt very ironically and tongue-in-cheek, sort of says it was necessary for peace that one man have control over everything, right? So this is the way to solve all the crisis, is to have one person in power, which is perhaps very opposite to what we've just been hearing from Polly about how the Greeks can engage with peace. But what happens as a consequence of that and the creation of an imperial idea of peace in the form of the Pax Augusta, which the Romans use far more frequently than the phrase Pax Romana. But I think Pax Augusta, so the Augustan peace, we can translate as imperial capital I peace. It is the peace of the emperor. That's an absolute. You're not making peace with someone. It's just sort of peace achieved, pax terra marique, peace by land and sea. And so we see that in Augustus's Res Gestae, his account of his achievements on behalf of the empire, that he was able to establish peace by land and sea through victories. He's very explicit about that. But we also see that in his victory monument at Nicopolis, at Actium, or where Agrippa had defeated in a minor skirmish the fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. That has in the Latin inscription Parce Parta Terra Marique, so with peace won by land and sea. So this is the kind of imperial gift that we see. But in the imperial period, we still come back to the idea of peace is something that you have to pay for, but it's worth the cost because of the protection that Rome will give you. So Tacitus in his histories in Book 4 is giving an account, so historically we're in 70 CE, where there are uprisings in Gaul, as a consequence actually of the civil wars that Rome itself has been undergoing because of the rapid turnover of emperors after the death of Nero. But he places a speech in the mouth of a Roman general Cerialis addressing Gallic leaders, basically justifying, look, you guys have money, you have resources. These are things that people are always going to want. You cannot escape war. The only thing you can do if you want peace, and this is what we offer because we are victors over you and have been previously, is to pay, so that there can be no peace without arms. And you can't have arms and soldiers without paying military pay. And we can't pay the soldiers military pay unless you pay taxes. And this is what binds the empire together as a sort of connective tissue that you, the victors and the victors and the vanquished alike, need to love and cultivate the idea of peace and being part of this global civic community. That's the sell, right? Tacitus is also aware of what the opposite viewpoint might be in his Agricola, very, very well known, very oft quoted speech of the Caledonian chieftain. The idea that the Romans rob, plunder, and they call this empire, they call it imperium, and where they make a desolation, they call it peace. And this is the false names of empire. So this idea, once again, of imperium, of command, and the ideas of peace being bound up together, but this being questioned, the ethics of empire being questioned in the very language that Rome uses to justify empire. Of course, that sort of part of the speech, and the whole speech, which is a condemnation of Roman power, is sort of often taken out of context because it's then followed by the speech of Agricola himself and the subsequent massacre of the Caledonians by the Romans. But it still shows an awareness, and we have to be aware that writers like Tacitus are educated in rhetoric and could argue both sides of the argument because they could. But it does sort of hint at awareness of what the arguments from the opposite side are about the violence of peace, the dangers of peace. Cicero was likewise concerned about the management of empire in the late Republic. He wanted to sort of see the empire as a protectorate rather than as an empire. But he saw the actions of various Roman governors as kind of destroying that Rome was meant to protect its allies rather than extract from them. But it also brings us to the idea, Virgil in his Aeneid in Book 6, speech of Anchises to Aeneas in the underworld, sort of ends with the argument that, remember, Roman, these will be your arts, that you will bring a custom of peace, you will impose a custom of peace, that you will defend those who have been subjugated to you, you will weaken the proud. But it's all framed in terms of this art of peace that Rome is bringing, that the power of Rome is kind of built on the backs of the subjugated, and it's kind of sold and presented in the language of peace. But then it always comes down to a peace for whom, and how do those who are subjugated to that peace respond to it? And we get varying ideas and messages and responses from those who are subject to Rome's empire.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very macro-political understanding of peace, not a personal understanding of peace, an art of peace that's somehow exclusive to the Romans. I thought it was really fascinating to hear you talking about the Cerialis passage in Tacitus' histories, which really speaks to a sort of fatalism that war is inevitable, which then feeds into this idea that it results in a kind of an economy or a marketplace of peace somehow. Peace is something that, as you say, you have to pay for. It's just very, very interesting to see how conceptualizations of peace are intersecting with all these other discourses, other ideas of protection, security, stability, economy even, and power. So we've been talking about how peace was conceived in different ways in both the Greek and the Roman worlds. But what I want to do now is dig a little bit more into how peace was actually made in Greco-Roman antiquity. And Polly, I wonder if you can talk us through some of the key mechanisms that were deployed in classical Greece for resolving or ending conflicts, and indeed for maintaining stability. So you've already mentioned a treaty, but we could think about truces, how these functioned, how effective or non-effective some of them were as well. It would just be interesting to hear a little bit more about peacemaking in relation to how we understand peace.
There's great variation in practices and in terminology. So we find sort of different terms used, and there isn't a single word for treaty or even for truce. In terms of personnel, there aren't quite diplomats, but there's an expectation that people should be able to send messages to and from states, even if those states are at war with each other, and that the people taking those messages, heralds, envoys, should be protected. So it's not unheard of, but it's bad practice to attack and certainly to kill a herald or an envoy who's coming to try and establish some sort of peace agreement. So the Athenians every so often will throw a herald down a well, but they're not meant to do that. This is frowned upon. So we can assume a certain amount of sort of back and forth between warring parties to try and set up the idea that a peace might be made. Then the terms of the agreement will be drawn up, probably debated. Certainly in Athens, we know that this happens. It would be debated in the assembly. There'd be discussion about what appropriate terms would be. Probably again some back and forth. This would vary in different city-states depending on their own political systems. But although ambassadors are sent, often multiple ambassadors, so they very rarely send one person, they would send a group of ambassadors. It's very unusual for those ambassadors to have the authority to make a peace agreement or a treaty by themselves. It has to come back, be discussed in the state and then agreed, and then there'd be another sort of set of back and forth in which the ambassadors might go back to the other community. There'd be swearing of oaths when the agreement was formalized, and that swearing of oaths is the final stage, the penultimate stage, because then the agreement is often written up on some sort of public, so on stone, on bronze, and placed usually in a sacred place, so in a sanctuary, sometimes sanctuaries within the cities, sometimes also one of the Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, so a sanctuary that was used by multiple communities. So this agreement would be advertised to the wider Greek world. So that very broadly, and oversimplifying quite a lot, that's sort of the process. As for what those treaties include, again, there's a huge amount of variation. There's some sort of clauses that recur. So often there's mutual obligations. So a commitment to defend the other community. So if that community is attacked, then City A will go to the defense of City B, and City B will go to the defense of City A. Sometimes there's also an offensive undertaking. So if City A attacks City C, then City B will go and help City A in its war against City C. So often there's an expectation of war, of future conflict is built in to these agreements. And then there are sometimes sort of other clauses, often more specific things depending on the particular concerns of the communities. So something that we find in a peace agreement made between Athens and Sparta during the Peloponnesian War is there's a specific clause for the Spartans that the Athenians make an undertaking to help out in the case of a revolt of the enslaved community within Sparta, because that's more of a live worry for the Spartans. And there's no parallel clause about the Spartans helping out in the case of a slave revolt in Athens, because rebellion of enslaved people isn't something the Athenians are bothered about. So they don't have that clause. So we see some very sort of local variation depending on specific circumstance.
And I think that mention of the one state helping another out with a slave revolt is a good reminder of the question that Hannah raised, which is peace for whom? Peace for the political elite, a peace that serves their interests but doesn't necessarily trickle down throughout society. And Polly, often these treaties had a kind of a defined time period, didn't they? They weren't for perpetuity, were they?
That's right. So sometimes, the truces can be very, very short, so days. just to give enough time for people to sort of stop and regroup and then start fighting again. 10 years is a relatively common time period, and we do find, again, we see this in Thucydides's account of the Peloponnesian War, we see a real awareness that the clock is ticking on a peace treaty. The 10 years peace is about to run out, and the sort of expectation that once this peace expires, then we'll be back to the state of war that existed 10 years ago. 30 years is also quite common, and that's an interesting period because that's also the sort of shorthand for a generation. And so one way of interpreting a 30-year peace is that a community is sort of willing to bind itself for its own lifetime to behave in a certain way, but doesn't necessarily want to commit the next generation to having the same policy. So that might be one reason why 30 years comes up relatively often as a time period. And we do find agreements that are made, in theory, in perpetuity, that are going to last forever. They're not enormously common, but they're not one-off. And also, what's interesting is it doesn't seem to be an obvious change over time. It's not that they sort of start off in the archaic period with 10-year pieces and then get more and more ambitious, that we find perpetual pieces sort of occurring from the start and all the way through, and then we also find 30-year pieces coming up all the way through. So some of this might be coming back to just that process, the sort of back and forth by which these agreements are made. Someone in the assembly stood up and thought, 30-year peace sounds good to me today. Someone else stood up and said, no, let's make it 10 years. And we can't always reconstruct, actually very rarely can we reconstruct why a decision was made to go for a certain time period.
And presumably some of it is less about ensuring peace for that length of time than more about ensuring the other parts of the agreement for that period of time. So binding a community to help defend your community for a certain period of time, but not so long that you can't renew that treaty and rethink those interstate relations in due course. So we perhaps make the mistake of thinking that the peace treaty is primarily about peace, and it is about a kind of more complex set of interstate relations, presumably.
Yes, I think that's right. There's often, they're very pragmatic, often these agreements, and they are about, where are we going to campaign next? Who's the current enemy that we need to be worried about? So I think that's quite right.
Mm-hmm. And Hannah, some of your research has delved into the mechanisms for conflict prevention and resolution in the Roman world, in particular the intricacies of diplomacy and negotiation. So Polly's painted us a picture of Greek envoys going backwards and forwards, and maybe the terms being debated back at home and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about how diplomacy and negotiation worked in the period of the late Republic, and then maybe even, how much that changed when we had the arrival of a sole emperor, as you said, the sole guarantor of the Pax Romana, or indeed Pax Augusta by then?
Yeah, listening to Polly talking about the mechanisms of peacemaking in the Greek world, I think there are perhaps unsurprisingly quite a few similarities for Rome, because at least in the mid-Republic, Rome was in many senses another Hellenistic state. Most of Rome's agreements and negotiations were with the Greek world. And so the idea of truces lasting a few days so that you can collect your war dead or make further arrangements, that treaties again had to be agreed on by the state. So for Rome, a treaty is not a treaty, it would argue, unless it had been ratified by the Roman people. They also have used some interesting aspects of diplomatic negotiation from Rome's relations with other communities in civil war. Cicero tells us that after Brutus and Cassius et al. Had assassinated Julius Caesar, and then they sort of got rather worried about what was going to happen to them and fled up the Capitoline, that Marcus Antonius negotiated a treaty with them, or at least a sort of peace negotiations with them. And the way he was able to secure this was by sending his son as a hostage. Cicero refers in his first Philippic to Antony's son, who's only 2 years old at the time of being sort of sent up the Capitoline, hopefully with attendants. But he refers to him as a hostage of peace. And this plays into this sort of interesting idea of hostage giving and negotiations. And Livy on several occasions talks about hostages being pignora, being these sort of epignos, a sualty, a guarantee of future peace. And so there's this playing with the idea that you need to secure peace and peace negotiations by offering something that is a sign and symbol of good faith. And what we see them doing quite a lot in these negotiations is sending their children. So it becomes important the ways in which in civil war, these sort of diplomatic practices from external rules are being used both in practice, but also in terms of the rhetoric of legitimacy and delegitimizing opponents. Once we get to the empire, in many respects, practices remain the same, but the emperor does become a focal point of embassies, particularly embassies coming from communities that are already part of Rome's empire. They seek the emperor, whether he is at Rome, whether he's outside of Rome, because they understand that he is the focal point of power. But we have evidence of the emperor Tiberius, for example, repeatedly sending embassies to the Senate and wanting the Senate to deal with embassies, because that is one of the traditional roles of the Roman Senate, is to welcome and give audience to embassies from other communities. So there's that sort of tension between who should be dealing with embassies and negotiating with communities, both internal and external to Rome's empire, that the emperor is the person who communities really want to forge a relationship with. Because whilst we're dealing with diplomatic relations between communities as independent, autonomous civic communities in the Republican period or communities that are quasi-republic in the imperial period, it is still ultimately about interpersonal relationships, about friendship, about hospitium, so guest friendship. So we're often seeing international relations acted out, but through personal relations and almost generations of friendships as well. At least in the Republican period, and in the imperial period, then it's always about having that personal connection as far as possible with the emperor.
There's so much to unpack there. And you're helping us understand the gap in a way between formal practices, accepted practices and underlying realities, and the way in which processes of negotiation and diplomacy intersect with ideas of faithfulness, good faithfulness, mercy and obligation in the Roman Empire. Always, you've made the point, this unequal setup of power where, peace can be conferred by the Romans on other people and it's at their discretion and therefore everyone else is at their mercy, whether that's at the mercy of the general you've surrendered to or at the mercy of the emperor who's got the final big say on so much. And Hannah, just sticking with you for a minute, you have looked in some of your recent publications at physical spaces of negotiation and the performance or the theatre of diplomacy. And I wonder if you can just say a little bit about the theatre of diplomacy.
I mean, this is not a new concept in contemporary diplomatic studies. The idea of theatre and diplomacy as theatre is well known. But I think it helps to think about diplomacy in terms of performance. Often we're seeing diplomacy in the Roman world acted out in spaces that perhaps reinforce those hierarchies of power we already spoke about, particularly in the Republican period from the early 2nd century BC onwards. You've got delegations, particularly from the Greek world, flooding into Rome, particularly after substantial wars and conflicts to pledge loyalty to Rome, congratulate Rome. And so this sort of convergence of the Hellenistic world to the city of Rome is the demonstration and performance of Rome's power to be able to sort of summon or convene the known world within their city. And then there is the control of embassies moving through the city. Are they actually given access to the city or not? If you're an embassy coming from a state with whom Rome is at war, going back to Polly's point about sort of envoys being able to move during war, having that freedom of movement, which the Romans also believed was the case, they're often not giving access to the city. They're restricted on the Campus Martius. Understandably, they're considered hostile. There's also a hierarchy of how the Romans allow embassies to petition the Senate. There is a kind of ranking system. And in some inscriptions, privileges are given to communities to petition the Senate outside the usual running order. But normally it's sort of kings, first of all, Hellenistic kings, friendly communities, and then dealing with others. There are various spaces in and around the city of Rome that are used as, we can think about them as stages for audience. It's interesting to see how those spaces of diplomatic performance shift and change as, unsurprisingly, the dynamics of power change in the Roman state. I mentioned earlier about embassies seeking out the emperor. So previously you go to the Senate. You also go around the houses of the elite, again, going back to those interpersonal relationships, trying to get their sponsorship in the Senate. But then, of course, the emperor is the person you're seeking. And so there's a great account of an embassy by Philo of Alexandria to the emperor Gaius Caligula. And of all the long delays and waits the bureaucracy of trying to access the emperor. We're told that there is even basically a senior civil servant who's in charge of overseeing embassies. So this is whole control and staging of when you get to see the emperor, how you get to see him. And they chase Gaius around the city from various imperial estates. They go down to Puteoli while he's in visiting and finally get back to him in the gardens of Lamria and Maecenas. And Philo really plays into the idea that this is theatre, this is performance. He makes the point that rather than this being what it should be, which is a sort of a court hearing, because it's the Jewish embassy against the Alexandrian embassy, he says this is like a theatre and we're on stage, and it's a kind of manipulation of the space in terms of theatre. So there's a lot of interesting things going on with dynamics, with the spaces that people are forced to inhabit and move through, but also the social spaces and the social relations that sort of shape diplomacy and the performances therein. I could go on about sort of the emotions of diplomatic performance. There's a lot of crying in the comitium that goes on in the Republican period. Showing emotion, showing distress seems important in terms of communicating to those you're petitioning in the Roman world about your distress. And it makes sense in a world where you're so remote, distances between your community and Rome are so far. Nowadays, everything is streamed through our TVs and our tablets, and we can see exactly what's happening in areas that are suffering in war and conflict and understand in small part the sort of human tragedy. But when you're an embassy among many embassies coming to complain about a Roman governor doing horrible things to your province, you need to bodily demonstrate that in how you dress, how you perform to those you're petitioning.
Really interesting. And these optics get you thinking about who the audience is as well, and presumably a relatively narrow audience. Some of this is spectacular and is performed for the wider public, but it's meant to land with a very particular set of powerful people with whom, as you say, you're also negotiating these interpersonal relations on the side, and all of that intersects with the political negotiations that are more formal. But a really fascinating glimpse there of performance as a key part of negotiation and diplomacy and conflict resolution, post-conflict transition and transformation. And Polly, that brings me back to you, because of course commemoration is a form of performance, and this is something that you've written a lot about, Greek commemoration practices, particularly in Sparta. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about what role memory, remembering and commemoration played in conflict transition or transformation in classical Greece.
It plays multiple roles, is the very short answer. I think we can distinguish between the sort of short-term, immediate commemoration and then the longer term, because one really striking thing about Greek practice is how the very, very long lifespan of some commemorative practices. If we're thinking sort of the immediate aftermath of a conflict, might actually not be the end of a war, but the end of a single campaigning season. Warfare, as I'm sure your listeners know, is quite seasonal in the Greek world, typically happens in the summer. And so at the end of the season, certainly in Athens and probably in other Greek communities, there is a ceremony for the dead of that year, which is in Athens is a collective funeral with collective rituals, which closure is a bit of a hackneyed term, but I think there is a sense of providing closure, particularly in cases where a body hasn't been returned. The body is very important to Greek funerary practices, proper treatment of the body after death. If the body hasn't been repatriated or possibly not even found, then having some sort of rituals and something for families to do in the absence of a body seems to be very important. So I think those immediate commemorative practices in Athens and also in Sparta, we know that Sparta doesn't habitually repatriate the bodies of its war dead, so they're buried on the site of the battle. So there's no body back in Sparta. So when we find the Spartans performing rituals for the war dead, I think part of what they're doing is sort of compensating for that absence or allowing families to compensate for that absence. So I think that's a big part of the sort of immediate commemorative rituals. And it is about maybe not so much transition away from conflict, but marking the fact that the conflict that has happened in that year. Then in the longer term, something that we see, but it's quite selectively applied, is that some conflicts get sort of elevated into almost mythological status, and the dead become treated as heroes, so sort of semi-divine. And this happens above all the Greco-Persian War, so the conflicts of 490, 480, 479, which are treated as special cases, and the commemorative rituals that surround those conflicts start very soon after the battles, as far as we can tell, but they carry on through the classical period, and we see them down into the Hellenistic period, into the Roman world, probably get reinvigorated, maybe slightly reinvented in the Roman world. And those conflicts this is maybe a place where we can almost use the sort of idea of glamorization, because they're really stripped of their reality and they become sort of mythical types of conflicts and are reimagined to suit the contemporary political agenda. So the Romans are quite keen in some contexts on the Persian Wars, because this idea of a conflict between East and West suits some of the wars that the Romans themselves are fighting later on. I, this weekend, called into the very small museum in the town of Megara, which has in it this amazing monumental inscription, which is a commemoration to the Megarian dead of the Persian Wars, and it has a verse epigram on it celebrating these heroes who died for Megara. This inscription was created in the 5th century CE, so about 1,000 years after that battle, and was set up in this town because it still wanted to commemorate the story that it was now telling itself about its part in this monumental war. Probably also a thing that's going on in this inscription is it is set up by a pagan priest who wants to make a point about the superiority of his religious practices over the up-and-coming Christian practices. And so there's all sorts of other conflicts that this commemoration is used to fight new battles in contemporary circumstances.
So the picture you're painting there is not at all one of conflict transition or transformation, but very much about conflict recall, conflict repetition, almost conflict perpetuation. In the encounters that I've had with Greek memorial practices and Pericles' famous funeral speech in Thucydides' histories, for instance, I've been struck by how phenomenally militarizing these commemorative practices often are, very much not about moving beyond conflict.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. It's about justifying future conflict. The Persian Wars are used really from 478 onwards to justify fighting more wars. That really striking, awful line in the Periclean funeral oration, when he, in theory, is consoling the mothers who've lost their children. He just says, oh, well, you can have some more children so they can go off to fight and be killed as well. So, yeah, it's not about stopping conflict. It's about legitimizing future conflicts.
And recruiting mothers to produce more soldiers, which is quite extraordinary as their consolation. Absolutely. And of course, those commemorative practices do focus, they centre around the soldier and they centre around the war fighting. And war, of course, is a much more expansive experience, and there are many, many more civilian casualties than there are military casualties in most conflicts. And, you don't have to die to become a casualty of conflict, to become a victim of conflict, or to be at the sharp end of its violence, direct and indirect. And that gets me thinking a lot of what we've been talking about today, the negotiation practices, diplomacy, conceptualizations of peace, discourses of peace, and just now the commemoration practices that we've thought a little bit about. These are all centre around the interests of a pretty narrow range of people in the Greek and Roman worlds. And one of the goals of the Ancient Peace Studies Network is to expand our understanding of ancient peace and peace building so that we actually look a little bit beyond war fighting and high politics and pay more attention to everyday experiences and grassroots peace building. And that is because peace must have been of concern to ordinary people, not just to politicians and military commanders. This is a very difficult question. It's quite mean of me to throw it at you. But what sources would both of you turn to from Greece and Rome to help us excavate more of a people's history of ancient peace and peace building?
So I think I had to think about this for a long time, and the best I could come up with, and it's a bit of an obvious answer, I think, would be Aristophanes' Lysistrata. Now, this is problematic because this is a play written by a man, probably primarily for men to enjoy, but it at least focalizes a female perspective on war. The plot, I'm sure, is familiar. The women of Athens and Sparta get together and go on a sex strike to try and compel the men to make peace. I mean, it's often written off as just fantasy, nothing to do with anything that could really have happened. But there's an interesting argument being recently made by a Greek historian called Peter Toneman, who points out that one of the sort of pivotal scenes of this play happens on the Acropolis, and the women seize the Athenian Acropolis and barricade it and won't let the men get in. Something that Peter Toneman points out is that the Acropolis is where the Athenians keep their money. That's where they keep the funds that they're using to pay for this war. The Acropolis is also a place where women have power, because the priestess of Athena, the goddess who owns this money that the Athenians are taking to fight the war, the priestess is a woman. And what Kahneman suggests, and I think is a very interesting suggestion, is that actually the priestess of Athena might have been able to exercise some sort of influence about what the Athenians were doing with this money, and suggest that possibly the goddess wasn't super happy on having all her money being spent on this war. So we might be able to read this play not just as a sort of crazy fantasy, what would the world be like if women had any power, but possibly even reflecting a real debate that was happening in Athens about, should the Athenians be using sacred money to fight this war? And this might have been a debate where women actually, they couldn't participate in the assembly, but they could exercise some influence. So that's the best I can do. And it's a little bit speculative, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
It is, and because of the nature of our sources, and this is why it was a mean question, we have to be speculative, we have to do speculative history, we have to fill in the gaps, but that is a really interesting possibility to conjure with and to imagine, and it opens up a sort of a wider set of questions that we might actually go and ask about other areas of Greek and Roman history. If we can see this sort of glimpse of agency, power, a connection to some kind of form of control through Aristophanes' Lysistrata, then maybe we can look for that kind of thing, that kind of voice and agency elsewhere. Hannah, do you have any sources from the Roman world where you might find more of a people's history of ancient peace and peace building?
Again, it is really difficult because of the nature of our evidence. I will say that in the civil wars, through both contemporary and later historians, we can certainly see different interest groups coming to the fore, particularly actually the soldiers in the Roman civil wars seem to play at times quite a critical role in pushing for peace rather than fighting, and trying to bring their commanders together on numerous occasions. And in civil wars, again, the issue is we're not necessarily dealing with grassroots, we're dealing with elite women, but we do see in civil war spaces opening up for women to negotiate, to mediate, often because they're family members of those in power. The other way to potentially think about it, and I think unfortunately it's still very much at a civic level of communities, but certainly in the imperial period, you can see a number of communities choosing to engage with the language of imperial peace as part of the way that they negotiate with Rome. And there's one other example which I think is really interesting. It's an altar from the south of France, and it's another altar to Pax Augusta, to imperial peace. It's set up by a Roman citizen, and we know that because he has three names. His name is Titus Domitius Romulus, and he's setting up the altar because of a vow he made, because he received an individual called Phoebus, who's been liberated, but he received him as a bequest from someone's will, sort of transfer of property, third-party ownership. And it's a little unclear precisely what's going on. Mommsen and the CIL sort of suggested that Phoebus was Domitius Romulus's natural-born son, who was a slave, and then when the master died, he was sort of passed on in bequest and liberated and manumitted and given to his father. But it's interesting that he decides to commemorate this using the language of imperial peace. But it's still a choice to sort of use that as a frame for what is engaging with a discourse of peace, but to deal with personal legal relations.
Yeah, very interesting there to see that discourse being harnessed in much more local, everyday context almost there. And a final question to you both, if I may. Another of the goals of the Ancient Peace Studies Network is to build dialogue with modern peace studies and to think about how new visions of ancient peace can deepen our understanding of contemporary discourses and contemporary approaches to peace building. So what do you think that ancient peace histories, the kind of material that we've been talking about, can tell us about peace and peace building today? Obviously a huge amount, but maybe just select one thing each. Hannah, do you want to go first, and then Polly?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope what our discussion today has highlighted are the complexities of peace in the ancient world, and that peace is not a static thing. It's not, the concept of peace is not singular, and it is very much dependent on socio-political, cultural, economic contexts, that it is not unproblematic, that it is not perhaps the solution to conflict in and of itself. As we've said, it's sort of, particularly with those Greek treaties that Polly was talking about, it's actually everything else that's going on behind peace. And that, at least from the Roman world, we can think about how the discourse of peace is manipulated and is used to justify systems of power, which unfortunately puts a rather negative spin on peace. So I have a screenshot that I still use in some lectures from the 21st of February 2022, and it was a then tweet, but now I guess an X post from Reuters, which was making a correction to previous tweets that they had made regarding the recent activity of Putin sending troops into the Ukraine. And it read, correction, in capital letters. We are deleting previous tweets that used Putin's description of peacekeepers, in inverted commas, in referring to the troops who he'd sent into the Ukraine. And I think that's, again, an indication, even nowadays, of how the rhetoric of peace is used to justify military operations, to justify and legitimize violence. The discourses of peace, I think, are very complex, but I think asking questions about both historic uses of peace and how they can help us reflect on contemporary discussions is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. The complexities, the socio-cultural, political context, and then, as you say, the very many different ways in which language of peace, claims about peace, discourses of peace can be talking about everything but peace sometimes. Polly, what's your take on this?
I mean, I completely agree about the complexity and the difficulty of sort of identifying real peace in our period. I wanted to try and be a little bit more optimistic, but hopefully not ridiculously optimistic. The Greeks spend a lot of time fighting, and they make a lot of peace treaties that don't last all that long. They keep making these treaties, and some of them work. And in spite of the fact that this is a society of hundreds, maybe up to 1,000 tiny communities with all sorts of stuff to squabble about, they develop enough of a shared framework and understanding and process to be able to talk to one another. They don't perfect this and they don't come up with a proper solution. They get somewhere. So I think there's something to be optimistic about when we look at the Greek experience of war and of peace, that even in a context overall of conflict and violence, the scope for making small gains, and those are worthwhile gains.
And the persistence with which that's done, and the way in which then systems and processes evolve out of that into, we hear a lot about the art of war, and then Hannah's talked to us about the concept of the art of peace as being a Roman form of imperialism. But actually what you're talking about there, Polly, is an emergent art of peace building, of negotiation, of diplomacy that isn't so formalized or conceptualized as such, but that is real and recurring across the Greek world.
Yeah, and doesn't rely on an overall power. It doesn't rely on an overall power. It evolved sort of a bottom-up way in which communities work out ways of dealing with one another, and a sort of shared set of norms and expectations that allow them to cooperate and communicate to at least some degree.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if you've convinced me of one thing today, you've convinced me of lots of things, but one of the things that I might take away from this is valuing the pragmatics of peace building a little bit more. I think it's we have a habit of idealizing peace and peace building. As you say, Polly, the pragmatics of trying and maybe failing and then trying again are not to be sneezed at all, and that's something that we can see recurring through antiquity. Hannah and Polly, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this subject with me today. I've learnt a huge amount. We could talk for much, much longer, but we will call it a day there with lots more to dig into and keep thinking about. And it's fantastic that you're part of the Ancient Peace Studies Network, and we can keep having these conversations with all sorts of other people in ancient and modern peace studies. So thank you. And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We do have some more episodes coming up as we continue to explore different visualizations of both war and peace in different contexts. So please do keep tuning in. If you would like to support our project, you can share our podcast with others in your network, and you can join the conversation further by following us on social media. Just search for Visualising Peace, or get in touch directly by emailing us at vispeace@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you very much for listening.